Welcome to another Mike Reads Reviews. After a very long wait and after many, many months, tonight we're going to be reviewing Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. And before we do, I just want to say that before I did this review, I went back and looked over my review of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. And in that video, I compared 12 Rules for Life to Talk Type at Work, and I said briefly that Talk Type at Work was kind of garbage. This book was kind of garbage, and I stand by that. So tonight, what we're actually going to be doing is comparing Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order to Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, so we can get an idea of what has happened in the exchange from one to the other, because I think his intention, based on the introduction to this book, which is a great read, I actually have that in, I'll put a link to this video's description to that read, because I actually did that on this channel. But I think his intention was for Beyond Order 12 More Rules for Life to be something of a sequel to 12 Rules for Life. And as such, since we'll be doing a comparison and contrast to that book, I'll be intersplicing in this video. I'll be editing in parts of my review from 12 Rules for Life. Tonight, we're going to be reviewing, as promised, Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules to Life, an Antidote to Chaos. So what we're actually going to start off with, and I don't think I really need to do a what is this, because I already did that. It's effectively a sequel to 12 Rules for Life, and as such, it is still technically probably falling into the greater heading of self-help books, but virtually all of my complaints in 12 Rules for Life were addressed at least in the first 7 chapters and in Chapter 9 in Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order. So let's start off with the good, and that is the first 7 chapters and Chapter 9, which, aside from being much less of a self-help genre, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the titles tend to be the focus of the chapter, and the chapter's focus tends to stay on topic more. I talked about previously how in 12 Rules for Life, he can get to be a bit circuitous at times. Jordan can get kind of circuitous at times, and I think in this case, when I said that I wish he would be more directed and on topic, in Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, Jordan Peterson is much more directed, much more on topic in those first 7 chapters. I kind of made a line in the previous video with my finger, and I think in 12 Rules for Life, there's the topic, and if you can imagine a straight line where you're focusing, just hyper-focused on that one topic, what he will tend to do is introduce the topic and then venture way out to left field and then finally come back to the topic at the last second. If you can imagine a straight line, right? That straight line is the actual claim from Rule 12. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street, right? So we get to about here, and then he veers kind of off course. And it's not until the very end that he comes back and gets back to the point. In Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, although it's not a perfect line, like some of the more on the nose, as I described it previously, economics readings that we've been doing, it's more ventures off a little, comes back, ventures off a little, comes back, ventures off a little, comes back, and still staying fairly close to that original line. So I think there's an improvement there. I think, too, one of the important things that happens in those first 7 chapters, and I think that the rationale behind that is actually explained quite nicely in the introduction to the book, which he entitles Overture, which he explains like where the idea for the sequel came from, what was involved in the thought process and the writing through all of this. Instead of this being just a strict self-help book, what the book is a self-help book. There's no other way to describe it. It's nothing more. It's nothing less. I can't honestly describe this book or go into this review with a description or characterization of the book as anything other than a self-help book. There's much more of it's much more of a course into the human mind. It's much more of a psychology lesson in these first 7 chapters. I'd say in terms of like a study on psychology, that's only about 15% of this book's content. So if that's what you're looking for, you're probably not coming to the right place. And for me, it's not a lot of news. It may be a lot of news for people who aren't as familiar with the field of psychology as I am. So for me, it's just not something I'm that much interested in. And even for me, someone who's very well versed in psychology, there were some insightful moments. In fact, there were some insights into the human psyche that allowed the book to, I think, in many ways, transcend the overall genre of just generic self-help books. And again, this is something that I mentioned in the previous video, and I think it's an improvement for it to be more than just a self-help book. And in this case, it is a bit of a course of study in psychology. And that's especially true, I think, of Overture, when it's the prologue to the book where, again, he talks about himself. He talks about what went into the book. And again, I think that provides more of an insight into the human psyche than really any other part of the book, which is why I consider it the best part of the book. And as such, I talked about how in the previous review that 12 Rules for Life, some of the highlights were his personal insights, personal stories, and the insights into his personal life. The number one highlight are his personal stories. And quite frankly, if he put out, say, I don't know, a 200-page memoir of his life, I would read that in a heartbeat. I'd read that is what I'm super interested in, because his personal stories to me are the most interesting part of the book. The Overture is nothing more than that. In the first 7 chapters, we get a lot more of an insight into his personal life. We get a lot more personal stories. And like I mentioned in the previous video too, we also get more client stories and the anecdotes from his practice as a psychologist, I don't want to say therapist, but his clinical practice. I loved those stories. And we get more of that in Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life than we do in 12 Rules for Life. Again, at least in the first 7 chapters and in chapter 9. And if I am going to contrast the two with Type Talk at Work, I think the statement prior about the comparison of 12 Rules for Life to Type Talk at Work holds true here. The book is significantly better than Talk Type at Work. Now, I mentioned too in the previous video that the ceiling that I have on this genre for me is going to be like an 8 out of 10. And we're going to come back to that, but keep in mind that the genre itself kind of has a ceiling, and it's a pretty hard ceiling because it's something I'm just not really all that interested in. So it was really nice to see that, again, virtually all of my complaints were improved upon in at least the first 7 chapters. And as such, I kind of blew through those first 7 chapters, managed to get through them in about 3 or 4 weeks, which for me is really, really fast for this type of a read. And then the second half of the book kicked in. And this, to me, is where the book kind of loses its luster, where I was ready to give this kind of as a maximum score. The second half detracts from for the first half of the book, for sure. And that's especially true of Chapter 8, which I would describe as totally unfocused gish gallop. And to show you guys, to give you guys an example of what I mean by that, I'm going to read just a small passage from Chapter 6, which is entitled Abandon Ideology. First things first, that chapter title, straightforward, easy to understand, and I love it. So this is from page 168, where he begins the subsection, The Fatal Attraction of the False Idol. Easy to understand what he's about to talk about here, by the way. Consider those who have not gone so far as to adopt the discredited ideologies of the Marxist-Leninists and the Nazis, but who still maintain faith in the commonplace isms characterizing the modern world. Conservatism, socialism, feminism, and all manner of ethnic and gender study isms, postmodernism, and environmentalism, among others. They are all monotheists, practically speaking, or polytheistic worshippers of a very small number of gods. These gods are the axioms and foundational beliefs that must be accepted a priori, rather than proven, before the belief system can be adopted, and when accepted and applied to the world, allow the illusion to prevail that knowledge has been produced. So it's really easy to understand what he's going for there. It's clearly on the topic of abandon ideology. It's in the middle of the chapter, so we're halfway through the chapter and we're still right on that topic of abandon ideology, and I love it. It's basically it's explaining that when you hold these a prioristic positions, these axiomatic fundamental beliefs, when you treat them as such, then you have treated them with a degree of theology, with a degree of theism. So even though you may not believe in a flying spaghetti monster necessarily, these fundamental and core beliefs form what effectively is, for the overwhelming majority of human beings, their religion. So I love this passage, and I love how it's written. I love how it stays on topic. It's a home run, and it's part of why the first 7 chapters were so easy for me to get through. Now let's read an excerpt from chapter 12. Chapter 12, by the way, was entitled, "Be Grateful in Spite of Your Suffering," which I get, but it's kind of a more ethereal concept. It's kind of less grounded and less directed. So let's read the excerpt from the section entitled "Courage, but Subordinate, Love," which I don't understand as a subsection title to begin with, and it seems to be quite separate from the idea of be grateful in spite of your suffering. That decision seems to me to be courage. That decision seems to me to be courage subsumed to love, whatever that means. If it is resentment and bitterness and the consequent hatred that emerges from that tempting us toward the torment and destruction of everything that lives and suffers, then perhaps it is active love that aims at its betterment. And that seems to me to be the fundamental decision of life, and that it is correct to identify it, at least in a vital part, as an act of voluntary will. The reasons for acrimony, anger, resentment, and malevolence are strong and plentiful. Thus it must be a leap of faith, a decision about a mode of being not so clearly justified by the evidence, particularly in hard times. That being should be strengthened and supported by our aims and acts. That is something done in some deep sense despite Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is an excerpt from a biblical passage. Something that says, quote, "Despite it all, no matter what it is, onward and upward," end quote. And that is precisely the impossible moral undertaking that is demanded from each of us for the world to function properly, even for it to avoid degeneration into hell. So, whatever that means. I honestly have no idea what he's going for there. It's incredibly hard to follow. Perhaps it's just too deep of a conversation, outside of context, of course, for me to grasp based on what he's talking about here. But I feel like it's not just a level of incompetence from my part, because I've had no trouble understanding his works to this point. And here we're not really. It just sounds like gish gallop to me. Now, the other thing that I have to mention here is that chapter 8 is probably the worst chapter and the worst bit of writing that he's ever put together. I read an excerpt from chapter 12, and chapter 12 was the longest chapter in the book, and I think the fact that these chapters were unfocused, especially in chapter 8, is kind of correlated with why chapters 8, 10, 11, and 12 are by far the longest chapters of the book and occupy probably a rough half of the book, despite them being only about a third of the chapters. 8, 10, 11, 12, 4. A third of the chapters occupy almost half of the actual content of the book in terms of the number of pages. I think he probably would have done better to attract my personal taste by making this book 20% shorter. So chapter 8 is just a complete mess, and it really detracts from the entire rest of the book. I could even almost forgive chapters 10, 11, and 12 because of how good chapters 1 through 7 and chapter 9 are. However, chapter 8 is just, I don't know how to get into it without reading the chapter to you guys. It's a chapter about art. And I mentioned in my review of 12 Rules for Life, one of the major detractants was the appeals to God. And I explained in that review that there's a difference between an appeal to God and a reference to God. There's a difference between a reference to religion and an appeal to religion. As Matthew 10:34 has it, citing Christ, emphasizing the role of the spoken truth, quote, "Think not that I have come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword," end quote. In this case, instead of referencing the biblical text, He's actually appealing to it. On page 224, however, he makes a reference to the Bible or to a biblical allegory to prove the point that is separate from the actual reference. A totalitarian never asks, quote, "What if my current ambition is an error?" End quote. He treats it, instead, as the absolute. It becomes his God for all intents and purposes. It constitutes his highest value. Even if we're going to look at this from a religious believer's perspective, I think we can all accept that the God is not of this earth. So to treat something as something that is not of this earth is to treat it like a God. And even for somebody who's a devout atheist, that's just a reference to that notion. Whereas when he says, as Matthew 10:34 has it, citing Christ, he's actually appealing to that word rather than to make reference to its notions. And I didn't mind the references to religion, but the appeals to religion and the appeals to God to me were really off-putting. So in this case, in 12 More Rules for Life, in chapter 8, the chapter is almost nothing more than, here are some excerpts of obscure poetry that I consider to be beautiful. Look how beautiful they are. I don't know what you're trying to get me to say here. You're not persuading me by saying, here's some poetry, isn't it beautiful? It's true that there might be beauty in this world, but you don't present it that way. You don't say, look at this, isn't it beautiful? You allow people to make that decision themselves instead of appealing to the beauty of the thing itself to make your case. So to me, this is just as bad as an appeal to God or an appeal to religion rather than a reference to it. So I always close with a rating on a scale of 1 to 10. Since I am comparing, let's do this for you guys so you can see it. Since I am comparing 12 Rules to Life to 12 More Rules for Life, yeah, I mean, I think this one was marginally better because it was in many places more focused, and I don't think that the chapters that detracted from the sequel really were any worse than the worst chapters of the original. So I think I would have to give it a slightly stronger 7 as compared to what I gave 12 Rules for Life, which was a weak 7. So I wouldn't say a very strong 7, but a slightly strong 7. And just very briefly, I wanted to get to this review much sooner than I did, but chapters 8, 10, 11, and 12 were such a brutal slog. That's why we have a huge gap. That's why we have and in fact, my memory of the book isn't well served. Honestly, I would love to be more specific about the book and give you more passages, more direct excerpts, but my memory of the book isn't very good because it took me so long to get through those final few chapters that I just lost track of some of the rest of the content. So anyway, that's been my review of Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order. Until the next time, this has been Mike, signing off.